Shalom, everybody. Welcome to Alma's exclusive webinar in collaboration with Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives. My name is Avraham Levine. I'm the new media director at Alma. Alma is a research and education center that focuses on the northern borders. So usually we're talking about Lebanon or Syria or the wider circle of Iran. But despite that's our expertise, we felt that recent developments in Israel need to be discussed and analyzed. And we were very happy to collaborate and talk today to our colleague and friend, Avi Melamed. Avi, that just disappeared. Does everybody see him?
Really?
Yeah. Avi is an intelligence analyst and an expert on current affairs in the Arab Muslim world and their impact in the Middle East. And Israel's geopolitical environment. He's a former Israeli intelligence official and senior official on Arab affairs. And I'm sure he'll help us understand, because as I said, we all learned a lot from the past 2 weeks and still a little confused. We're also joined by my friend and colleague, our very own Ibrahim Ahmad. He's the Director of Communications and Outreach at Alma Center, a master's student for national security at Haifa University. We wish him luck with that. And has a BA in international relations. Ibrahim completed his studies, started them in the American University in Cairo, and later on in James Madison University in Virginia. The recent developments in Sheikh Jarrah, Aqsa Mosque, Gaza, I think I got that right in terms of the chronological order, led to a widespread protests by Israeli Arabs all over the country, mixed cities, in the Galilee, that we were always proud of the coexistence and living together, and eventually resulted in clashes, riots maybe, lynch attempts by Arabs on Jews and by Jews on Arabs. And I think just so we can begin and understand what's going on, I think we'll start with Ibrahim, if we may. As a member of the Arab minority in Israel, can you share a little more about the Arab community, just up to the events, just in general, a few minutes on who are we speaking about?
Thank you, Avram. I think it's important to, like you said, we need to first understand what's this community we're talking about, and its complexity, because it's not just that we're talking about Arab citizens of Israel, because I think that's we can start with a politically correct term, Arab citizens of Israel. We're Arabs, we're citizens of the state. We're about 20% of the population, over 1.5 million citizens, about 18% of which is Muslim and about 2% is Christian. This also includes other minorities, namely the Druze minority. In times, it's added to that equation, and others it does not, and it definitely is the case when we're talking on political issues. The Arab minority, I think the one thing that stands out of what is this community is to understand that this is a community that it's in an identity crisis and an identity complexity, because we are stuck in the middle as a community. We feel that we are somewhere in between being Israeli citizens as well as being part of the Palestinians as a people. And where does that stem from? Where does that come from? I can give you very shortly from my own family's background. My grandma was born in Ramallah, moved to Bethlehem in 1942 up to 46, and in 48 during the war they moved to Tiberias. And when the war ended, they actually settled in a village near Tiberias on the outskirts of the village. On my dad's side, for instance, they're from Nazareth, and he used to take people that wanted to escape the war and cross the border to Jordan. And he would come back. He was 14 at a time. He would take people on camels. Why am I saying this? Why am I telling you all this? The reason why I'm emphasizing this is because it's important to understand that in terms of citizenship, the people of this area, of this land, where their citizenship was dictated by where they were in 48, 67, the major points in the timeline. And my family could have been, my grandpa could have been on the other side of the border of Jordan, and he could have ended up as a refugee, a Palestinian refugee. My grandma could have stayed in Bethlehem, and we would have been, maybe I wouldn't be born, but their family would have been today Palestinians in Bethlehem. And that's part of our reality, is the understanding that you could have been in some of these people's reality, or even in the Gaza Strip. So there is a connection on a people level, and especially when you include it in two entities that are locked in constant war, and we're kind of in the middle. That's what creates this identity crisis, and this actually is part of the issue that stems the frustration and kind of was major part of why people protested, and why did it end up in riots after the issues of Sheikh Jarrah and the Aqsa, Gaza Strip. There's a people connection, and at times it led to clashes and riots, and this is the situation. And it's because we, at the end of the day, we're connected by the same people, by the same story, I would say. It's just different chapters or aspects of that story. That's really in a nutshell. And the more we discuss it, I can definitely further explain that more.
All right, so just one more introduction that I think we need to do before we move on, and before we reach the question that's the reason everybody joined us, the big sentence that I might disagree with, but before we reach, is there a third intifada? I think, Avi, if you can help us, intifada, I remember when it happened. What's the word? What are we talking about? What's an intifada?
Ladies and gentlemen, shalom from Israel. Wonderful to be together with you. Ibrahim, Avraham, thank you for hosting this wonderful event. I'm really excited about it. Looking forward to this session together. The word intifada for itself, it's in Arabic. The word is translated as recovering after a long disease. This is a term that has been used by the Palestinians and adopted in the world. It became very well known. And basically, it's a term that describes two major periods in the complex history of Israelis and Palestinians, mostly Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and two episodes that are characterized by violence. We are looking at two major period in different times, and also different in terms of characteristics. The first intifada, roughly speaking, took place between 1987. By the way, it started in Gaza Strip on December 9th, and it was generated by a terrible car accident resulting in killing of nine or 10 Gaza workers, and that resulted in the outburst of the first intifada, December 9, 1987. It lasted until 1993. During that period of time, that intifada also used to be known by the name of the Stones Intifada. And one of its major characteristics was that it was mass protest, meaning what we saw during that intifada was a mass protest of Palestinians, both in Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including strikes, including riots, including demonstrations, including expressions of violence. But the major characteristic was that it was mass participation, and it was, at least to a certain point, it was conducted by a joint leadership of the Palestinian. Reminding you that time, the major leadership of the Palestinian is located outside the area in Tunisia. And that was the major characteristic of the first intifada.
But and if I may just as I remember it, I'm not of course underestimating, but stones, knives, that was no explosions, no guns. That was later on, right?
Well, there has been some attacks of using guns and knives and stuff like that, but it was mostly characterized, as I say, with this mass participation, cocktail Molotovs, stones, and all these things. That was 1987 to 1993. The second chapter of the violence, the second Intifada as it's called, was the one that took place between 2000 and 2007. And that was a totally different story in comparison to the first chapter. While in the first chapter that I described, we talked about mass participation and so on, the second one, 2000 to 2007, was on the one hand, less participation of masses, but on the other hand, it was mostly characterized by a much more lethal means, and particularly, other than gun shooting and so on, particularly the phenomenon of suicide bombers, Palestinian suicide bombers, or should I say Palestinian homicide bombers. And so we are looking at two different episodes that have the same name, but we have to distinguish between the characteristics, because these are two totally different chapters in the history of the conflict or the violent conflict between Israeli and Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I personally, during the first Intifada, 1987 to 1993, I was in my position in Jerusalem, and I was dealing a lot with that. I also was partly dealing with the whole issue of suicide bombers that we started dealing with in the mid-90s. And later on, I could share with you some personal stories, or to be more accurate, more personal observations or lessons that I took with me that I think or hope could be in a way adding or contributing for us for the understanding of the complexity of the situation.
So we went over the first Intifada, the second Intifada, 2000 to 2007, and the big question we're talking about is: are we facing a third Intifada? Characteristics? Who are the participants? What are we talking about, Avi?
If you are referring to the incidents of violence that took place within Israel, between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, my answer would be we are not dealing with a third Intifada for a couple of reasons. First, the two Intifadas that I was mentioning were basically focusing on the areas of the Palestinians outside Israel, namely the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, excluding Jerusalem, that was also a major stage, particularly in the first Intifada. But all other areas were areas of Palestinians outside of Israel, and they are not an Israeli citizens. The Intifadas, the first two ones, are basically fueled by sentiments and narratives that are anywhere between ending an occupation, fighting an occupation, aspiration for self-definition and national independence, aspiration of religious identity, and so on and so on. But when you look at the events that happened in the last couple of days in Israel, the incidents between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, I think it will be inaccurate to try to attribute to that burst of violence. It will be inaccurate to try to attribute to that the same narratives, the same factors that fueled the Palestinians' intifadas, meaning the one in 87 to 93 and the one from 2000 to 2007. What we see in the last couple of days in the context of the violence between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs is not fueled actually by those sentiments that I refer to. There are other factors that are involved in the story. For example, the fact, and I'm saying it very openly and very clearly, we are dealing, when we are talking about this violence between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, we are dealing with hooligans on both sides. We are dealing with Jewish hooligans, we are dealing with Arab hooligans, and in a situation of tension, you will always find the people that have the tendency in their personality to take action in a negative way, to incite, to inflict violence and so on and so on. And you find those people on both sides of the aisle. You find Jewish hooligans, you find Arab hooligans. These are the people that are involved in the recent violence that we witnessed between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. Overwhelming majority of the Israeli Jews and the Israeli Arabs are peaceful people. They are regular people. They want to live their life. They want to have future. They want to have income. They want to raise their kids. As always, and unfortunately, it is always the more radical, vocal, small group of people that in the end of the day capture the stage. But I think it's important to indicate that. And one last thing in the context of the comparison between the Palestinian intifadas, which were intifadas, and between the violence that took place between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, who I do not view as intifada. One last thing, I would say, if there is some kind of similarity, I would say that the actions of violence that we saw in the first intifada, in the second intifada, and the actions of violence that we saw in the clashes between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, they are in a way also a channel that express frustrations. It expresses some sort of resentment, discontent, anger. We have to understand what are the factors that fuel this anger and discontent. The factor that fuels the discontent and anger that we saw in the clashes between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs are different, somewhat different from the one that actually fueled the Palestinian intifadas.
Ibrahim, if you can, Avi mentioned frustrations and anger triggered by different events that blasted. Do you recognize similarities that that maybe Avi didn't touch upon in the Arab community? A strike, riots, things do seem a little bit the same. Do you recognize in terms of the feelings how things were perceived in the Arab community?
So I think that's where maybe a little bit me and Avi would disagree a little bit on, is that I do see it as, if it's not a third intifada right now, I'm seeing it as something that it's in the making. And the reason why I think so is first of all, particularly in the second intifada, the Arab minority in Israel was a part of it. On the 1st of October 2000, it definitely was part of the protests that went to the streets. 13 people got killed in those riots. 3 of them were from my neighborhood. So we as a community here inside Israel, we definitely felt, even back then, that we are part of this thing that was going on. This, as Avi correctly said, it's the frustration, and that explosion of frustration, we can definitely talk about justified or not, and the means, whether they're justified or not. But that feeling is what fueled the first intifada, the second intifada, and I think that's kind of like the frustration is what's fueling what's going on today. The escalation that we're seeing between Arabs and Jews inside Israel, I think that's the most dangerous thing of all. And here we can talk a little bit about what, like Avi just raised the question, what are we so frustrated about? And honestly, we are frustrated as a community. There are things to be that the community sees as truly frustrating events that happened. First, we can talk about Sheikh Jarrah. Even before the events of Sheikh Jarrah, we did see protests in Yafo by Arab community, by the Arab minority, protesting against Jewish settlers trying to move into Arab property in Yafo, aided by Ahmad company. Then we literally a week later, maybe 2 weeks later, the events of Sheikh Jarrah kind of took even a greater, I would say, view than it did before. Definitely when you're already on the wave of tensions, and people protested. The case of Sheikh Jarrah, that there are families there that were placed by Jordan after 1948, when Jordan took control over occupied East Jerusalem. It basically took this territory that was bought by a joint Jewish business or Jewish, organization that it's half Sephardic, half Ashkenaz, and it bought it in the 1900s or under Ottoman Empire at the time from Arabs who lived in Sheikh Jarrah. This territory was taken by the government, by the Jordanian government, and it was basically using the rule of the custodian of absentee properties. If the owners of the property are absent from the property and cannot show that they are the owners of the property, then what happens is the country tried to take control over the property from them. And that's what happened and Jordan took this land and basically built houses and put Palestinians who were mainly from West Jerusalem that escaped West Jerusalem in the war and resided them there. The Palestinian side says that that Jordan was supposed to give them rights and ownership over the property, something that never happened. And after 67, Israel occupied East Jerusalem as well. And then the territory, when you look at it again, the two organizations that bought the land also sold it to another organization, which basically tried to claim ownership of the land. And this is the case of Sheikh Jarrah. It's a complex case because on the Palestinian narrative, the claim is, if we're talking about property of absentees, and if the state comes back, then what happens to other properties of others? If we're going to go and look at ownership of properties in the Ottoman Empire, this is actually and honestly, there was one very interesting research by two Israeli researchers, Professor Yitzhak Reiter and Lior Lev, who pointed out that this actually can be a huge precedent. If you open this gate of trying to see who the property owned to in the past, then we're going to open all the documents, and are we supposed to all go back to where we were in the 1900s? I think it's extremely unrealistic. Whether or not that's true, the people, particularly in East Jerusalem, protested, and the biggest frustration of these people is that the protests were not allowed to be, they were not given legitimacy to protest in Sheikh Jarrah. I know personally people who were there, even when it's a group of girls, they would see a few more friends, and then the police would see that there were too many people. They were literally just standing there, that 6 people is a little too much, so they immediately threw a grenade at them. There was no proportionality, no absorption of the people's anger. And this, obviously, with the social media today, and definitely with TikTok, the videos went viral, and claims of police brutality, and people elsewhere started to protest as well. People wanted to protest in Haifa, in Nazareth, in Shvamer, where I am right now. And when they started protesting, I can definitely share that in Haifa, the people that were in the protests were academics, people that I know, that are friends of mine, that went there to protest, to raise their voice. And the protest lasted about 10 minutes. 10 minutes in, the police came in, threw grenades, dispersed the crowd, and my friends literally were running throughout the streets of Haifa like criminals in the middle of the night. And there's a small story that one of them kind of like sarcastically started to yell while they're running from the special forces. Somebody called the police because we feel like we're being targeted, and obviously he's escaping from the police. And this kind of led to the explosion that we saw later on, an unjustified one. I have to emphasize this because it goes too many times without a critical denounce of violence, not enough by leadership in the Arab community. So we're putting it here right now. It's absolutely repulsive that it took to the measures of violence that we see, because it detaches from the problem. Instead of focusing on the frustration of the people, on the fact that you feel that you're a citizen, that you deserve equal rights and equal right to protest, now everyone can just point out and say, well, I mean, you're acting violently. And this is against our own interests as a community. In fact, what's going on in Gaza Strip is against our own interests, because instead of the state dealing with the issues that we're raising and the frustration that we have and the demands that we have to maybe look over the case of Sheikh Jarrah again, because these people were started to get evacuated starting on May 2nd by the rule from the Israeli Supreme Court. Maybe there could be a re-examination or anything of that sort, but Hamas struck Jerusalem. So the state is all focused about Hamas, and then we're like kind of a forgotten entity, which added more to the frustration that we're kind of like pushed aside. And honestly, this violence and the Hamas and what it is doing, it's pushing away from real legitimate claims. And unfortunately, in my view, it's really easy for the state to escape kind of to that place where we can just talk about we're talking about terrorist organization. So, and it's a terrorist organization attacking from civilian population to civilian population. Here, I can just easily show, where they are wrong and I am right. And instead of talking about something that's even more complex, which is what's going on inside Israel within the two communities. And this led to protests as well as violence and repulsive violence. What happened in Lod, literally it's a catastrophe for the city. That there are clashes in that you need literally a rule of law or special forces to be present at all times to maintain security. And people are frustrated and people are afraid because we see attacks of Arabs on Jews and attack on Jews on Arabs. And nowadays you're walking feeling like, I haven't came to work in the past week. I used to go jogging in the Krayot area. Now I don't do this anymore because I'm terrified. And people don't understand it. And this is part of our frustration, and we can definitely elaborate more. I don't want to, take it too much onto this angle for now, because we're definitely going to touch upon this in a bit.
I actually think it's an important part of the issue. Avi, before we move on to Hamas, I'd like if you could just spend a few more minutes to maybe help us out here a little with the triggers, because Al-Aqsa obviously is very sensitive. Temple Mount, I understand we have to be very careful there. Sheikh Jarrah completely surprised us. I don't think if anyone thought 2 months ago that Sheikh Jarrah will lead to clashes and riots. So can you help us with what's the next trigger? What are we supposed to look for?
Well, first, generally, I would say, look, we have to distinguish between the chain of events that led to this eruption. And then Ibrahim was talking about the story of Sheikh Jarrah. We talked about Al-Aqsa, Jerusalem, the mosque, and so on. That was the chain of events. The real triggers are elsewhere. It has to do with Palestinian inner politics, the power struggle between Fatah and Hamas over leadership. Remember, Hamas is standing for an outlook that is summed up in the concept that says Palestine should be free and only through violence, and it means that the state of Israel has to be eliminated. Fatah is basically approaching much more pragmatically and say, look, the state of Israel exists. It's a fait accompli. We have to find a way to end this conflict through negotiations and concessions. Hamas stands for an Islamic agenda with everything that comes along with that. Fatah emphasizes the nationalist, I would even say, / quote unquote, secular elements of such identity. In other words, we are looking at two major Palestinian powers that are engaged in an historical, ideological, political, military power struggle, once against the other. I'm reminding you, Hamas crushed the Fatah and Palestinian Authority rule in Gaza Strip in a violent coup in 2007. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed in those clashes. So this is one aspect. This is the inner Palestinian power struggle. The second aspect has to do with regional powers. Hamas is very much connected to the Iranian program or expansion program in the region. Hamas and Islamic Jihad, to a large extent, are acting as proxies of the Iranians in the service of the Iranian hegemonic vision. By the way, today, I was reading an article, one of many, but I was reading an article today published by a former Jordanian minister who said Hamas waged a war on Israel and attacked Israel in the service of Iran. That, he said, that was an Iranian war against Israel. And this is a sentiment that is very much, by the way, you could find it very much common in different circles in the Arab world. So this is kind of like some sort of like, if you wish, a geostrategic picture of that specific story. But let me take it down to a very, very ground level and actually from my own personal experience. You know, when I was 29, I was nominated to be deputy advisor to Arab affairs in Jerusalem. I remember my meeting with the legendary mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek. And he basically said to me, he said, look, I heard some good things about you, and you know, it's a very sensitive position, and what do you think about the position? And I said, look, you're taking me and you just put me on the edge of a volcano. In Jerusalem, I'm 29 years old. I didn't even know how much I'm going to be correct. It wasn't on the edge of the volcano. They just put me inside the crater of the volcano, and I had to deal with this reality. Just so you can understand, I started my position in the summer of '90. 2 months later, I found myself involved in the whole terrible, tragic incident in the Temple Mount compound, resulting in the killing of some 24 Palestinians. You may remember that. That was the events of October 1990. And I spent the next years in Jerusalem dealing with this whole growing and bursting violence, reminding you, this is the time of the first Intifada that I was talking about before. Jerusalem was on fire. And I want to share with you a couple of observations that I took personally from my days in those times in that position regarding the issue of the conflict. You know, when I used to sit in forums talking about the situation, trying to find solutions, practical solutions, I said to people, I said, look, here is my problem. I said, my problem is not to indicate the 30 issues that could easily trigger a fire. The Temple Mount compound, the old city, Sheikh Jarrah, settlements in Silwan, and many other. That was not my problem, because I knew to point on those things. My real problem was the other 100 issues that I was totally unaware of because I didn't know of. And one of the things that was very characteristic of the situation in Jerusalem, and by the way, I think it's very characteristic in the context of any conflict, and particularly conflict that involves so much narratives, political, historical, cultural, religious, like the one in Jerusalem. One of the things that I have learned was that in such situation, everyday life, most ordinary things that in essence have nothing to do with conflict. Everyday life, ordinary things are being channeled, recruited, drafted, if you wish, in the service of the narratives, of the conflicts, of the sides. Each side used them according to his interest, narratives, and so forth and so forth. You have no idea how many times I find myself on a verge of a volcano because Jewish neighbor threw a garbage on his Muslim neighbor in the old city of Jerusalem, or vice versa. That gives you an example of what does it mean that everyday issues are being recruited or drafted or channeled into the conflict. One other thing that I want to share with you again from my own personal experience, and it has to do about perspectives and how sides view such a reality. And I'll talk in this case about the Israeli Jewish side, and I'm going back to Jerusalem, the late 80s, the middle of the 90s. Teddy Kollek, a legendary person that I had the honor to work with, was identified in the world with one of the most prevailing Israeli Zionist Jewish narratives. I emphasize Israeli Zionist Jewish narratives. It was by far not any narrative of the Palestinians, and not only Palestinians, but also it was not a narrative of the Israeli Arabs. The narrative was talking about Jerusalem as symbol of coexistence. And Teddy Kollek was so much attached to that narrative that he could not see the reality, even when I told him, this is not the reality, this is your wishful thinking. The reality is different. I'll give you an example, a story that really happened, one of many stories. When the Intifada, the first Intifada took place in Jerusalem, 60 Minutes program, they came to Jerusalem. It's a very well-known program. They came to Jerusalem to do a special coverage about what's going on in Jerusalem, the whole story of the Intifada. Teddy Kollek told me, listen, he said, we're going to the old city of Jerusalem. We're going to the Nablus Gate that was just recently in the headlines. And we're going to sit in a coffee place, and we are going to talk, and they are going to take pictures, and they will interview, and I, meaning me, I will talk with the Arab residents, and I will translate to Teddy. And I said to Teddy Kollek, I said, Teddy, that's a bad idea. The Intifada was raging in Jerusalem, but he insisted. We went down to the Nablus Gate, the same Nablus Gate where we had these recent riots and clashes going on. We sat there in a coffee. Long story short, we ended up inside the coffee house crying because there was a tear gas all around us, because there was a lot of havoc going around us. And I will never ever forget the US, the narrator of 60 Minutes stand weeping like a baby because of the tear gas and screaming to its cameraman, shoot it, shoot it. In other words, what I'm sharing with you are my own very unique personal experiences in situation of a conflict, and particularly since I was in the middle of this volcano in Jerusalem, which I think are very relevant in understanding and trying to analyze situation on the ground and perspectives when you are dealing with a complex conflict. One more note, and Ibrahim obviously I'm sure will elaborate on that, talking about the Israeli Arabs in the context of everything that goes around. Overwhelming Israeli Arabs do not share the Zionist narratives. They don't. Ibrahim will elaborate on that. He will talk about their multi-layer identity, and they have a multi-layer identity of the Israeli Arabs, but I think it's important to make this observation. I'm not making here an observation out of criticism. I'm making here a professional, objective observation. I do not expect Israeli Arabs to share my Zionist narrative, and I don't think that the fact they don't share my Zionist narrative, there is something wrong about it. I don't think that. I just have to make clear when I'm saying that.
Ibrahim, if you can, I think it's about time we talk about this. When we wrote the last newsletter, we sent it out yesterday, 2 days ago, and we wanted to end with a sentence, and we weren't sure how to phrase it. And it's exactly this question. So I won't ask you the numbers. I don't expect you to know how many Arabs are Zionists or not Zionists, or grade them from 1 to 10 on this virtual. But I would ask, how do you think us as Israel, as the administration in Israel, can deal with the Israeli Arabs when Avi's right? There's a lot of people. Like you mentioned, you didn't see any Hamas flags, but it came up on the news. And on the other hand, there's Israeli Arabs that even serve in the army. I mean, don't tell anyone, but Bedouins serve in the army, Druze serve in the army, Muslim Arabs serve in the army, Christian Arabs serve in the army. So there's a big variety. How do you think How do we deal with this? How do you see it from your perspective?
So, first of all, definitely we as a minority, as I said before, we are a very complex minority in terms of our identity. I think we're like a collaboration of the identity of, trying to understand or trying to grasp our own Palestinian identity mixed with Arabic identity. And I think that was also even more fueled during the days of Nasser, because there was a very Nasseristic mindset, particularly within Palestinians. It worked wonders. Nasser's ideology that we're all Arabs, there is pan-Arabism, we're one unity, one community. For the Palestinians, it was great. Okay, so if we're all Arabs, that means that everybody's going to come in and save us. So a lot of people adopted this very pan-Arab nationalism as well. And there's also the other component that we're Israeli citizens. And we're also part of the culture, or the kind of like the melting pot of cultures that existed here. We use so much Hebrew in our speech, and Jewish people use a lot of Arabic when they speak in Hebrew, especially when they curse, because we're more expressive when we curse. So
you're a fan of Maccabi Haifa in soccer. Come on.
and Maccabi Haifa as well. A lot of Arabs grow up in the youth teams as well, in the Maccabi soccer team. So there's a lot of collaboration, and you are mixed in this society, and your reality at the end of the day is effectively different than that of somebody who grew up in the West Bank, and definitely our Gaza Strip, and for sure than that of a refugee. So we are in a very peculiar position, and we're still trying to kind of understand our own identity and what that is, and where we can find our own root. And I think most people kind of feel that they're somewhere in the middle. I'm a Palestinian. I'm part of that overall arching people, but I'm also Israeli citizen. And if you ask about the role of the state, I think the biggest issue when we talk about the role of the state with the Arab minority in Israel is accepting that there is such thing as called as a Palestinian identity from the get-go. We're Israeli Arabs, not Israeli Palestinians, for example. In a slang kind of way, Arabay Israel and not Palestinian Israel. And there's a sense within the Palestinian community, and definitely inside Israel, that there is kind of a neglection and a refusal to accept that this identity exists. And accepting it and kind of like, embodying it, rather than just say, instead of me feeling like I have to choose, it's either or, let me be both. And it's not given enough. And the state can definitely reinforce that and strengthen that, instead of put you in a position that, well, I mean, we don't really recognize the Palestinian identity, especially not yours. You're Arab. You're not, you're just an Arab. And Arab is a very vague word. I have friends in the Arab world, and I have nothing to do with their culture. With some, I speak English because I don't understand Moroccan Arabic, for instance, at all. So we are different groups of Arabs, and our community is a Palestinian, and people need to also understand that as well. And like you said, Avram, when somebody raises a flag, a Palestinian flag, in a protest in Shvamer or in Nazareth or in Haifa, there is a perception within this overall Israeli community, well, see, they're supporting Hamas. And this is where even more so Hamas is frustrating us, because if you raise it definitely now, with rockets being launched from Hamas, the automatic assumption is that you're supporting Hamas and terrorism. Even though your personal motive might be to connect with your own, with people and the suffering of people in Gaza Strip, rather than supporting of a terrorist organization. I think the discourse has become so black and white and so extreme that there is no room in the middle to, it's either black or white, and there's nothing that is gray, even though in our reality, particularly in this country, in this region, everything is gray, everything is in the middle. And we've kind of, forgotten about that. And adding the problem of us understanding our own identity and the state not understanding our own identity, that it builds a problem within our own society. And in terms of the community, we're seeing that people are more and more understanding that we're Israeli citizens, we're accepting that fact, we're accepting that reality, but we're also Palestinians in our identity as people. And we want to be equal rights, equal citizens as well in this country. You know, you might argue service or not in the IDF. This is, you know, a question for another time. And what does that mean, equal rights? And there's always that discussion about Arab minority in Israel. But the fact is, a lot of people want to just live their life. But when they feel that there is injustice, they want to also be able to express it, protest, and feel that the country is behind them rather than pushing them away. And this is some of the sentiments. If you look at the media, the biggest problem that we see today is that
There's no Arab here.
it's not showing
No, אני רואה את
us.
הוובינר.
I think it's Sarit on the line, and can you unmute yourself, please, Sarit? Thank you. I think part of the problem that we see today in the media as the Arab minority, that our story is not talked about enough. You know, there are a lot of reports about what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in on the outskirts of Gaza, and the people being in the shelters. But what about Arab students at Haifa University scared to leave the dorms? Or my cousins, for instance, their door was scratched on to mark their house as Arabs in Haifa, which is supposed to be, you know, the flagship of coexistence. Their house and their neighbor downstairs, the two houses that are Arab in this building, they scratched marks on their house. And this brings extra frustration of, then what are we supposed to do as a minority? What do you want from us? This is literally the feeling of the people, and that we're not getting enough coverage. And once we talk about lynch of Arab on Jewish person, it's, you know, it's obvious. Arabs attack Jews. It's what they do. And when a Jewish person does it, it's a massive shock. No one believes a Jewish person can ever do such a thing. And it gives us a view that there is a superiority view on us, that, you know, Jewish people are saints. And, you know, if that happens, if a lynch happens against a Jewish person, it's unbelievable. But if an Arabic person does it, then it's understood that, you know, it's what they do. And if we look even more deeply on problems of the Arab community, because we have a lot of demands, a lot of issues, mainly the issue of violence and guns, in the illegal guns in the community. If you want to look at the cities that had the worst riots and the highest number of violence, are cities that have more and more the town's rule of law, not the Israeli rule of law. There is no rule of law in these cities overall. And once you have escalations like these, people who are in mobs, people who feel that they control the area, they will use it to riot because they're hooligans, not because they have any political perspective or ideology. The people who burn tires at midnight or burn 3 buses in Shvamer, they're hooligans. I doubt that they have any political sentiment whatsoever. They just use a bunch of 16-year-olds who use this time and escalation to do vandalism. And if you look at the cities, for instance, like Akko, Lod, Bethlehem, Umm al-Fahm, you see that these are towns that had more escalations and more violence and internal violence and more weapons and more crime. So you see that even explode even more now. Whereas in other cities, like in Shvamer, for instance, as soon as a few kids burned a bus, a few kids burned 3 buses in the city, immediately the entire city went against them. Even when protests were harsh and with a lot of chants, it never escalated to that amount of violence. So people feel that they are not saved by the country. The police is not on their side. No one's collecting these illegitimate weapons in their towns. And then when we have an explosion like this that has also geopolitical fuel into it, this violence increases even more. And this is what we're seeing today. And this is not to say that this is only the government's fault at all, because we as an Arab community, we have a very tendency of victimization. It's easy to be the victim, not at all, because we need to also be harsh on people who commit these kind of acts of violence and lynches and horrific things and burning Bate Knesset, and it's despicable what's going on, and it deteriorates, and it also pushes away from real legitimate things that we want to put forth and argue and discuss and show our voice. Instead, the entire country can easily just focus on those people who are doing horrific acts of crime.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We're almost an hour in, but I feel like I don't want to move on to the Q&A without giving some hope. So, Avi, I think Ibrahim already touched about the beginning of an answer of what can we do better in terms of recognizing the identity and the trouble in the dualism in the Arab minority. But can you give us just what can we do to improve the current situation?
Sure, but before that, first, I want to say that I totally agree with what Ibrahim said, particularly when he was referring to the part of the lawless people, the people that feel that they are out of law. By the way, this is people that feel that they are above the law. And this is one of the common denominators between the Arab hooligans and the Jewish hooligans. This is one of the, differently from Ibrahim, I would say openly, I hold Israeli government responsible first and foremost. Yes, obviously there are inner domestic issues that fuels those criminal elements, but it goes back first and foremost for sovereignty, to issues of governance. And Israeli government failed to provide the Arab communities with sense of security, law, and order. That's the reason I hold the Israeli government accountable and responsible for that. So that already gives you some immediate answer of what has to be done. First, restore the law, restore the order, restore the deterrence of the law. You know, the IDF is now engaged in a war, and the name of this campaign is Guardians of the World. And one of the major purposes is to restore deterrence. This is the same name that is very much fit to the purpose or to the need to restore the law, the rule of the law in Israel. And by the way, it applies also for the Jewish hooligans. The same thing should be applied for them. There should be no concessions. It has to be very clear, no concessions, not to Jewish hooligans and not to Arab hooligans. I want to add something just to say, before moving on to say what can be done, some observation that I would like to share with you. When I look at the situation and I'm trying to understand or decode the process that Ibrahim accurately described when he talked about the elements, the criminal elements within the Arab society, I think that when we have to expand a little bit the zoom, and I would like us to go for a minute to look at a different arena, but it's very much relevant in the context of what's going on. One of the major powerful shapers of that reality is the events that happens in the Middle East. And in that sense, I would just say as a general observation that, roughly speaking, given to the turmoil in the Arab world, and reminding you, Israeli Arabs are in their multi-layer identity, one of their major identity, as Ibrahim mentioned before, is that they are part of the Arab world. And given to the turmoil in the Arab world, the Arab Spring, the violence and the wing and a dogmatic wing, the uprising of civil society in Arab world. This is something that also happened. All those things and many others impacts the Arabs in Israel, the Israeli Arabs. And I would say, largely speaking, that if I would have to say what is the major characteristic that can be attributed to the Israeli Arab vis-a-vis all these events that I described, I would say there is a deep sense of confusion in a way, lost of way. I'm saying that because what I'm arguing is that what we saw right now, this burst of violence, and now I'm talking about the Israeli Arabs, I think it's being fueled by the combination of a generation within Israeli Arabs that is watching what's going on in the Arab world and has no clear leadership and compass that can guide him and navigate him through this complex reality. And in the same time, it's a generation that also experiences the loss of compass within the society, mostly represented in the fact that there is a growing volume of crime in the Arab society, as Ibrahim mentioned. The combination of these two things was also playing very significant role in fueling the flames that we recently saw. Avraham, going back to your question, what has to be done? First, restore the rule of law, restore the deterrents that law represent. Second, address seriously the challenges, the grievances of the Israeli Arabs. I just saw the other day an interview with a guy from Jaffa that was engaged in the demonstrations, and he basically said he was talking about everyday life needs, like apartment. He was like saying, we live in a small apartment of like 50 square meters. We need larger apartments. We need solutions to practical things. The Israeli government, and I'm going back to the Israeli government has to address those grievances seriously, not cosmetically. I expect Israeli Arab leadership to come forward and to make a clear distincting line between what is legitimate, what is illegitimate. I expect Israeli Arab leadership to come forward and to present to the community, the Israeli Arab, a clear, constructive moral compass. It's also part of the responsibility of the Israeli Arabs. There are many different ways, options to enhance, advance all kinds of initiatives that could rehabilitate. We need to rehabilitate the foundations of the trust between the communities. Remember, in the end of the day, we have two large, wonderful communities of wonderful people that are working together side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in hospitals, in academic institutions, in NGOs, in companies, in cultural activities, you just name it. Those are the factors that has to be further encouraged. This is our mission. And I think that doing all these things in parallel, in combine, will be very significant in restoring and rehabilitating the fabric, the delicate fabric of coexistence of Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. If I in Jerusalem never ever really believed, as I said before, that was a real coexistence, because I was able to see that there is no such real coexistence, and it was in the case of Jerusalem a merely Israeli Zionist wishful thinking, that is not the case in my view in the context of Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. I do believe that there is a real coexistence, there is a real fabric of coexistence. It's always a very delicate fabric. It always has to be maintained, supported, further nurtured, and so on and so on. It's in our hands.
Thank you, Avi. We're going to start with just touching on a few questions that were asked, and I think you touched about the law and order, which is very important and came up. Ibrahim, another question, a question that came up about Sheikh Jarrah. And we spoke in length about this yesterday. There's the legal issue and there's the political consequence of either way. And the question here is this an opportunity that if the law gives in and to the political consequence, is this can this help with the Arab community on one hand? And on the other hand, is this a victory for Hamas? Do we have to calculate now? Are we helping internally and being hit from externally?
Well, first of all, it fuels me even more that it can be analyze as a Hamas victory if that's the case, because we as a community had protests that were trying to just voice a frustration over a situation and seeking justice on something that we feel unjust. And now we go back to Hamas. It's always going back to Hamas, and that's frustrating. But I understand it, and it's unfortunate. I don't think this is possible anymore, since after the ruling of the Supreme Court, I'm not sure if it can be overruled now. I can say that it could have been something that these residents, if it was done right, with the right also passing the information that the Israeli government understand the position of what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah. Because of the situation, we feel that these people are already residents here for the past 70, 60 years, since 56. I think they built these houses in 56. So they've been here for 50 years. And we can't just kick them out right now without any other place to be, so that the owners can be compensated and so on and so forth. Because also when we talk about the legal aspect, there's the other problem. If this is, if we're going to open every document of that used to be of absentee and now they're here, then what about the houses of the people in West Jerusalem that used to be owned by Arabs? Are we going to return them now? Are we going to reopen all these cases? It's a very problematic place to get into in terms of the Israeli courts. So there is that issue, and I think that it was not enough addressed and understood what the complexity is and how. I think the Supreme Court just saw it in a very black and white. The document, this is the ownership, simple. It wasn't simple, but like eventually that's the solution they went with, and also the time. I mean, the evacuation on May 2nd in the middle of Ramadan, right before Layt al-Qadr. A week later, you have Jerusalem Day for Israel, and then you have Quds Day for the Iranians, and then you have Eid al-Fitr, and then you have all these things, and then you have on the 15th you have the Al-Nakba, the memory of the catastrophe, the Palestinian. So all these things happening in May, and then you're deciding to evacuate these people in the beginning of this month.
We're not going to change the calendar, Ibrahim.
It doesn't look like they have. So I think that I hope that answers the question.
Avi, there's a question here that I'd like you to answer without touching the specific politics. But there was an interesting development that I don't know if it will work now and will develop even further. But Mansour Abbas made a step. He changed the position, and for the first time in a long time, an Arab party was almost a part of the government, the coalition, and in this case, even a right-wing coalition. So can you touch, is that also a good development? What can happen from that?
Yes, it's a very good development. And let me go back to what I said before. Let's understand where this development comes from. What does it stand for exactly? It goes deeper than a political maneuveration. Remember what I told you about the impacts of what's going on in the region on the Arab world. One of the things that I mentioned was the split within Muslim Brotherhood chapters between radical camp on the Muslim Brotherhood on one hand and pragmatic camp of Muslim Brotherhood on the other hand. Look, Mansour Abbas is coming from the hub of Islamic thought, the southern branch of the Islamic movement in Israel. His ideological hub, his ideological landscape is an Islamist one. However, one of the significant things that happened in the region in that specific context was that there is a sense, a growing sense in the Arab world of starting to wake up from the age of slogans and rhetoric. Ibrahim mentioned earlier the issue, the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the legendary president of Egypt, that was leading this big slogan of pan-Arabism. And the whole Arab world was chanting, this is the cure to our challenges. Finally, we are going to be cured and deal with all our challenges. That will lead us to the shore. It didn't happen, of course. And basically what you saw all the time is on and on and on, all kind of slogans, rhetoric that basically express the wish of people in the Arab world to find solutions to their grievances. What we see in the last particularly decade, because of the situation in the Arab world, the gloomy situation in the Arab world, is that more and more people in the Arab world are starting to depart from the language of rhetoric and slogans. Among those people are also people that are coming from the Islamist mindset. Islamist mindset centered around the concept al-Islamul Hal. Islam is the solution. It's not to say that these people actually abandoned that concept, but basically what they're saying, yes, Islam is a way of life we believe in. We think it provides people good answers, but it's not enough. You have to provide people with good answers, not to tell them slogan that could provide them good answer. And this is a big difference. Mansour Abbas, in my view, reflecting this growing pragmatism. Mansour Abbas is not Zionist. He will not be Zionist. And that's fine. But as long as he is carrying the flag of pragmatism, that's a good news. That's a good news for everybody. I don't expect people to change their ideological skin. It's not my job. I have only one wish, that if somebody has an ideological whatever outlook, it wouldn't be on the expense of nobody else. And if somebody wants to do real good things in the service of the community, he should be pragmatic. It applies to both sides, obviously, Jewish and Arabs as well. So in that sense, I think that Mansour Abbas is reflecting this understanding of the need to be pragmatic, to start departing from rhetoric and slogans that sometimes are very destructive, and to start adopting this pragmatic approach. And I think it's a good signal. And again, it's very much connected to what I said before, the impact of the events in the region that percolates into the Arab society.
Ibrahim, we're getting a few questions about Sheikh Jarrah, and I think we're too short on time to get into details, but I would suggest two things. If you can put in the chat links to both articles, both, can you do that online? Are you that talented? If you just add it for them, I think people are interested in real data, really understanding the situation. So if you could find the two.
I have the two articles. So basically, in order to understand what's going on, and I was talking to Avram about it a lot, I didn't want to come out and say something that it's very unintellectual, I would say. And I started looking for articles about the situation. This is one that I'm sharing with everyone on the chat. This is by two Israeli researchers, and which very much talks about the property and stuff like that. It's a very in-depth article, very long one. And then there is another one that I'm sharing right now, which brings more the Arabic perspective. And it shows the Palestinian narrative and view of how things are going on particularly in Jerusalem, in terms of taking control over territory and stuff like that, and the Zionist dream, or if you want to do it in the Palestinian side, the Zionist nightmare. So they talk about that as well, and you can see and read two different views and ways to look at it. I think the one thing in common between both articles is that they both emphasize that a change in the status quo was the danger, and there need to be a pragmatic solution. We talk about pragmatism to Sheikh Jarrah rather than a very cold, this is the territory, this is the property, this is the ownership, and that's it.
One more thing to you, Ibrahim, a question that I'm curious if you can help us with. You spoke about the let me be both identity. That's how the question was phrased. I liked it. Do you think this identity is accepted by the Palestinians? How do they see how would they answer you if you presented the same answer? And the attendees in the webinar were Palestinians from Nablus or Ramallah or Bethlehem.
I think people do understand, definitely among Palestinians. There's a way that they always express it. It's like putting it in English, it's kind of like, this is the situation you were born into. This is, you were forced upon this. It wasn't your first choice. As if to say, if you decided or chose to be Israeli, it would have been one thing, but if you were born into this reality, it's a different case. And we understand that you were born into it. And the main part is that you don't forget your Palestinian roots or culture or background or history. And I think for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, I think they do understand this complex identity, because if you look at the people that go to the West Bank, definitely for shopping and groceries, are people who are from the Arab minority in Israel. And they actually rely on that on the weekends for groceries and stuff like that in the main markets of Jenin or Barta and other areas. And it's not like, they put them on the entrance to these areas and ask who feels Palestinian, who doesn't. There is an understanding of this complexity of identity, but they do, and I understand why, they want more solidarity. I think they expect solidarity because we come from the same people, and that we should be more united. I think that's where the fine line would be. And I think, embracing both identities, it's a process. It's not like it didn't happen for me in a magic wand that, like, today I say, I'm both and this is who I am. It took me a while. Like in certain periods in my life, I was more leaning to more Israeli, and I wasn't even more aware of political issues. And then I was, and then I was feeling more and more close to my Palestinian side. And then it eased down a bit, and then I was like, okay, hold on a second, I'm being very nationalistic. But then that's when I lived in the US, and then I come back to Israel, and then all my friends and the place I work with are Jews. So how, it has to be something in the middle. And I think it took me a while to find this place in the middle. And we as a society, it's taken us a time. It's a process. It's not, like we say it now and tomorrow everybody's going to feel this way. It's going to take time, and everyone needs to be involved in order for this to actually flourish. We as a community, with leadership, stating that this is the identity, because I think that the leadership's all sometimes scared of stating this complex identity. And also, like I said before, the government, the country needs to also accept that there is such an identity, that it's a Palestinian one, also among people who live inside Israel and are Israeli citizens.
Avi, a few words before I sum things up.
Few words in Hebrew, in English, in Arabic.
That would be an interesting. I think if you'd ask me the beginning of the solution, it would be what you touched on right now. Before we get to all the big ideologies, let's start with learning Arabic. One of my big regrets. I'm still planning to fix that. No, but if you can in English, just a few words about to answer Ibrahim or give us something from your experience.
Yeah, well, I mean, I totally agree with many things that Ibrahim said. I definitely understand where he speaks from, and I easily, comfortable with that. I mean, look, I was thinking about the fact that there are people who are being threatened by other people's identities. I was, the other day I was interviewed in one of the channels, the big channels here. I was running from studio to studio. One was in English and the other one was in Arabic. But in both interviews, I saw this demonstration of Israeli Arabs in Haifa, young people. They look exactly like any other Israeli, I would say, roughly speaking. And some of them were carrying a Palestinian flag. And I was saying to myself that I didn't feel that I was intimidated by that. I was fine with that. though I know that there are other people who feel intimidated by that, but this is something, as Ibrahim said, everybody has to go through its process. I believe that Israelis, Jews, and Israeli Arabs, most of them, have the capacities, the tools, the abilities to go through this process, not to feel intimidated by the other's identity. And as Ibrahim said, this is a process. I believe in the vital forces of the Israeli Arabs and the Israeli Jews. I believe in the many aspects of everyday life, perspectives or manifestation of the coexistence, not quote unquote, real coexistence. Coexistence is a very delicate matter. Everybody knows that everywhere in the world. We are going through rough days. We will pass that. We will pass this wave. I believe in our forces and powers to rehabilitate, to rebuild the connections and the belief, because in the end of the day, here is the one very simple, concrete truth that is non-disputable. Nobody is going nowhere. We are here.
Thank you, Avi. I see there's a few comments about Sheikh Jarrah, but I think it's too many details and legal arguments that at least I can't deal with. I think we covered the situation with the Israeli Arabs and the triggers. We're still left with Iron Dome questions and missiles and rockets being shot at Israel as we speak. Ibrahim, just, I have a pop quiz. What was your first thought when your farmer was hit last night? Who were you angry at?
Oh yeah, honestly, it took me a while to grasp that there's a siren in our town, especially because we live in the north. And my first thought was, as soon as I heard the sirens, was, I hope it doesn't hit a house. That was the first thing. It just, as long as it doesn't hit a house, I don't want it to hit a house. And thank God it hit open area. It hit the soccer field actually too, but there was nobody there, thankfully. And I don't want it to be, let's just put it this way, I don't want our unity as people and as citizens here to be infueled by, because we saw deaths and because Hamas killed Arabs as well as Jews. I think it needs to be deeper than that, and a real connection and a real belief in a mutual way ahead. And yeah, absolutely. If it would have hit a place, the one thing I would point at is Hamas. I mean, like it's not said enough. Hamas is but definitely in the Arab community. And I think one of the issues that there is a sense, if you don't criticize Hamas as an Arab, then you're suspect of that, somewhat suspect of maybe supporting it. No, against violence at all sides, at all times, especially terrorism. It's unacceptable, and it's pushing us away from the real topics, and it could have done it again. And thankfully, nothing happened here in Shvamer, and we hope to pass this very, very difficult time. Something that's very frustrating for me personally, someone who does believe in shared living and did believe in shared living, and now I feel somewhat betrayed, I have to say, by everyone, that there is no real belief that it's gonna, that we can overcome differences, and I'm frustrated. It's what it is, but we do hope for better days ahead. We're friends outside of work too, me and Avram, and nothing will change that. He comes from a very different background than mine, very different political opinions. Like, I think we're literally two sides of a spectrum in times, and in times we agree, and I learn from you and you learn from me, and this is what we're supposed to do, and encourage discourse, because that doesn't exist enough. Let's encourage discourse. Understand each other, understand where we're coming from, because we're lacking that a lot. We're good neighbors at times when we don't have escalations, but we haven't been, even at the best of times before this escalation, we were good neighbors, but we weren't good friends yet. And this is the next step.
Well, that's a great note to end with. That was beautiful. But I want to thank everyone for joining us, having the patience to listen to Ibrahim when he goes on a rant. And I'd like to invite you to the next webinar. Will already be next week about IDF's attacks to Gaza, the question of collateral damage, Iron Dome defense systems, human shield. So a completely different discussion. Next week, just follow us for the details, and we'll also send it out in the newsletter. I'd like to thank you from Israel, from the Galilee. Have a great week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Avi.
My pleasure.
Thank you all.